They say the Mississippi keeps a tighter mouth than any confessor. But on that humid August night of 1847, even the river could not swallow what crawled out of the Bogard plantation. The air was slow and heavy, sweet with magnolia and burned sugar. The cane leaves clicked like fingernails. At 3 in the morning, when even the bravest dogs will not bark, 23 souls watched Charlotte Bogard cross from the slave quarters to the big house in a white nightgown, freighted with a darkness that was not mud. Her eyes were pale and emptied, as if the body had locked the door, and the spirit, too courteous to knock, had simply gone. 2 days later, the sheriff's ledger grew a clean white wound where that night should have been. The parish priest, who had ridden hard with his stole in his pocket and his lips already shaping Latin, would not speak of it for 40 years. By the end of the week, every man and woman who had stood inside the quarters that night had been sold away like seeds thrown to separate fields. The land pretended mourning, the sun stood up in the cane, and wagons groaned as if nothing had split. But the split remained. Baton Rouge in those years wore 2 masks. The new capital had come upriver from New Orleans with its crisp laws and oily ambition. The old world stayed put. Planters with sugar-stiff collars, a hierarchy pressed like a seal into wet wax. At the apex perched Senator Theodore Bogard, 45 and burnished by success. He held 3,000 fertile acres and 137 enslaved bodies who labored a mill that outsweetened all its rivals. In the Senate chamber, his voice steered money, railroads, and iron-toothed codes that bit deeper each year. His wife, Charlotte, drew the town's eye the way a storm draws iron filings. She had come from Charleston 5 years earlier, slender as an exclamation, and 20 years younger than her husband, trailing French and Latin and, more strangely, several West African tongues she said a nurse had sung into her when she was small. In parlors she ranged where ladies were not meant to range, speaking of medicine and history, laying a finger on the world's pulse and counting out its odd rhythms. There were people who called that clever. There were people who called it improper, and there were a few who, in private, called it dangerous. The big house glared down on the river road with white columns like sun-bleached bones. 22 rooms inside, each more upholstered than the last, paintings of saints and horseflesh and European winters nobody here would ever see. Beyond that grandeur lay the map that mattered. Not the usual far-flung rows of cabins set safely away from the master's windows, but a horseshoe of 30 small houses cupping a larger building at the center. The enslaved called it the keeping house. People went there to be born, to be tended, to be prepared. Others said the keeping house held what the river could not carry and the church would not name. Among them was a woman the ledger called Mary, 30, housemaid. She penned her name, however, as Marie Claire, and the letters sat proud on the page. She was quiet, the kind of quiet that gathers facts, and she moved in Charlotte's orbit like a moon bound by a dark gravity. Heat pressed that summer as if the sky had stooped to rest on men's shoulders. A strange fever took them, white and black alike, kindling hot at dusk, coffin cold by dawn. Dr. Josiah Henley said yellow fever to the town and something else to his journal. In that weather, Charlotte took to walking at dusk, not the garden paths but the packed earth toward the quarters. She said she carried medicines. Theodore, knotting railroads in his mind and polishing speeches with his thumb, let charity pass for charity and did not follow. On the 15th of August, the Bogards' lamps shone bright with guests. Judge William Treadwell, planter Charles Dufresne, and Father Bernard Lair from St. Joseph's. After brandy, the men closed themselves into Theodore's study, and Charlotte rose, hand to her temple, and excused herself. Marie Claire, in the one statement she left before vanishing from record and from sight, said the mistress paced, whispering syllables that clung to the air like wet linen. At 11, Charlotte dismissed her for the night, a small new thing that would later look like a hinge, and left in a white gown with a leather satchel. The overseer, Jonas Hartley, saw her pass the oaks. He called. She did not answer. She moved like a woman drawn forward by a taut line none could see. In the keeping house, song coiled through the beams, not a hymn and not a work chant. Older. The notes vibrated in the ribs. Celia, the midwife, was tending a girl named Deline when Charlotte appeared in the doorway at midnight to the minute. The satchel bulged. Her feet scarcely met the floorboards. Her eyes had turned their whites to the world and hid the irises. Yet she moved as one who can read every nail, every knot, every breath. She spoke then in a tide of Yoruba that rolled the room back to its far coast. She untied the satchel and drew out things Celia later refused to describe. Not for Christian rooms, was all she would say. The work, call it ritual, call it doctoring, call it trespass, ran 3 hours long. Heat slicked the walls. The singing learned a second voice and then a third, until the floor itself seemed to answer. At 3 o'clock the sounds collapsed. A scream came, not from any throat in the room but from the wood and the clay, as if the building itself had lungs. The door flew wide. Charlotte stumbled out, the nightgown no longer white but marked, stripes, slashes, a script the eye could not hold without aching. She buckled to the dirt and shook. That was when the men came in their shirt sleeves, the law and the church and the state hot on their tongues, and found something none of those tongues could fasten. What followed was the South's best trick, burial without a grave. Charlotte went up to the big room with the good bed. Henrietta lit the lamps, and Dr. Henley came with his bag and his notebook. He found a body fever-hot, then corpse-cold, and skin on which patterns rose like bruises that were not bruises. When he listened at her lips, he heard words that did not live in any book he owned. Theodore bought silence with signatures. The keeping house burned in a tidy accident. Every witness was sold to a different weather. Father Leah wrote one letter to his archbishop and was sent kindly away to a parish where the road ended. But seed travels underground. In the quarters, among those who had learned to carry news in their bones, a rumor moved that Charlotte had not been taken by anything but had gone seeking, and had been taught by an old woman they called Mama Shara, brought from Haiti and clever with the world that runs parallel to this one. Mama Shara had died 2 weeks before, no fever, simply time, and Charlotte had sat beside her as if waiting to borrow a final word. Charlotte rose from her sickbed in due time and resumed her rounds with the same small smile. If she remembered, she did not say. She avoided the burned space where the keeping house had stood. She stopped walking at dusk. Now and again, a watcher swore her fingers traced patterns in the air, and her mouth moved without sound. Theodore hardened into purpose. He hammered through stricter codes, no night gatherings, no drums, no unsupervised prayer. Men nodded and said, "Prudence." Those who had watched him flinch at the ashes knew better. He slept badly. He ate little. He wrote more. In November, a long, narrow scholar from the north arrived on some pretext about sugar and mills. He called himself Professor Augustus Brenner and tucked himself into the St. Charles Hotel like a knife into a good sheath. He asked after the layout of quarters, the names of the sold, Charlotte's life before Carolina, the sort of questions a botanist might ask if he believed guilt grew in rows and bore fruit. He found holes. The finishing school in Paris had no record, though a boarding house in the Latin Quarter remembered a woman who read until dawn, with men who spoke of natural philosophy and meant something older. A Haitian scholar named Jean-Baptiste Dessalines walked in and out of that picture and then vanished, and the collection he kept, texts and relics and words, always words, vanished with him. Brenner followed a trail of receipts and lies to a tavern in Port Allen, where a former overseer, drunk enough to be honest, said, "She brung something in that satchel. When she opened it, the night had joints. 2 days later, the overseer died the way men die of fear." By December, the plantation had begun to dream with its eyes open. Theodore woke with scratches on his forearms, thin lines arranged almost as letters in an alphabet a little to the left of visible. He spoke in sleep with voices that did not belong to his throat. An old woman in Creole, a child rattling Latin numerals, a chorus like leaves turned metal by frost. Charlotte hummed in languages that had no nations. Some nights she seemed doubled, seen on the veranda pouring tea at the same hour she was seen kneeling at a grave in the family plot. Witnesses, knowing themselves sober, came away less sure. On the 10th, Dr. Henley's notes thickened with disbelief. Charlotte's belly swelled and stilled in rhythms that did not match any calendar the body normally keeps. Beneath his stethoscope he heard not one heart but many, out of phase, then together, then climbing into some complicated harmony that made his own chest forget its task. He stepped back as though the sound had weight. A week later, a woman introduced herself at the door as Madame Celeste Arsenault, Charlotte's kin from New Orleans. She could have been 70. She could have been not any age at all. She asked for soil from 7 places, water drawn at the new moon, and blood from every living person on the place. The overseer balked. Theodore's temper, frayed to threads, snapped. The vials were filled. That night all the flames burned a little green. Shadows pooled where walls met floors, and did not thin when candles came close. Marie Claire, who had found ways to come and go unseen, watched in the cemetery as Charlotte and the veiled woman pulled something slick and tender from a grave that should have held only memory. They carried it home like a relic. Theodore, in the doorway, wept and whispered, "The circle turns." On December 20th, Charlotte announced that she had just conceived, though the body told another story. 9 days, she said calmly. 9 nights. On the 10th day, in the 9th hour, it crowns. Berner, reading old church books in a back pew, marked his calendar and felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. Animals told it first. At dawn, the roosters died and arranged themselves in a ring as neat as a wedding band. At noon, the pigs knelt and did not rise. The horses smiled with dead mouths. The cows lowed a chord so strange it felt learned. By evening, Charlotte was gone from her bed, and in its place a hole had appeared. No splinters, no collapse, just the absence of floor, a perfect circle that drank the lamplight like water. Her footprints were many footprints, child, maiden, matron, crone, all walking together toward the charcoal square where the keeping house had once breathed. In the burned center she had cleared a smooth circle. She sat there, white gown and leather satchel, and shadows stood around her like a congregation called back by name. Each time she lifted a vial and poured it into the ash, a figure deepened. She scattered soils by patterns that would not have stars until astronomers found them. She unwrapped the thing from the grave. It did what no dead thing is meant to do. It grew. Dr. Henley attempted to break the circle and felt a century pass through him in one heartbeat. Burial mounds, broken treaties, chains, lullabies, midnights, names taken and names hidden under tongues. He understood then, no summoning. A birth, not of one child, but of all the ones the land had been owed, gathered into a single urgency. The wind went wrong. Leaves spun inward. Theodore lifted a pistol with a shaking hand he did not recognize as his. Charlotte's eyes rolled down from their whites and found him. Pity lived there, and a clarity that burned. "It's done," she said softly, and the words seemed to arrive from everywhere at once. "The land takes what it is owed." She cried out, not pain exactly, a sound like a door opening in a house you thought had no more rooms. Her belly flattened as if a tide had gone out. The bundle stood up on legs that learned as they moved. A child stood there, or the idea of a child, its face passing through faces, its voice speaking all the local histories at once. River tongues, field tongues, hunter tongues. I am the debt made flesh. I am the sorrow given form. I am the memory that cannot be buried. The men aged in minutes, hair grayed, hands shook. The thing touched Theodore's shoulder and whispered something he would never write down and could never forget. Then it dissolved like breath off glass, and there was only Charlotte, pale as the inside of a shell, asleep. For 3 days, sleep held her. In that time, the house found its own mind. Mirrors cracked into maps of escape. Books reordered themselves by grief and then by hope. Everyone in the quarters dreamed the same dream. A child small as dusk walking door to door, pressing a bloody hand to each lintel and leaving knowledge, names, directions, lines that stretched across states like threads catching light. When Charlotte woke, the world put its face back on. She did not remember. Madame Arsenault had no room, no trunk, no name. Father Duchesne from New Orleans arrived a day late with old oils and older words. He looked and listened and wrote a report he sealed and sent away. A balancing of the ledger, he called it, the land's accounting done in shadow and blood. Within a week, Theodore freed the people he had owned and cut the papers that gave land and coin enough to begin. And if anyone asked why, he would only say, "I have seen the bill," and stare at the middle distance until the questioner remembered an errand elsewhere. Charlotte lived 5 more years, sane and sociable, provided the dark never took the lamps. In the night, she sometimes woke sobbing for the child in the shadows who wanted to come home. By daylight, she wrote letters under other names that led men to the remains of those who had not been granted graves, that stitched families together from fragments, that slid deeds into the right hands. Theodore argued for impossibilities in the Senate, reparations, returns, reversals, and his colleagues smiled sadly and called it madness that sounded like prophecy. In his journals, he wrote to the keeper, begged time to prepare the vessel, and described dreams in which the future stood on the threshold and would not leave. Professor Brenner mapped incidents that rhymed with Bogard, women in other parishes and states who crossed the same threshold and paid the same price, nodes in a net hung wide across the South. A working, he said, that had been begun by people who first named the rivers, broken by those who came with flags, mended in part by those forced across the sea, finished, or at least forced forward, by women in white houses who had stood close enough to both worlds to become a bridge. The cane failed completely the next harvest, blackening overnight, and no buyer would sleep on the land and keep his mind. After Charlotte's death in 1959, peacefully with a nun copying the script that had risen on her skin like stories the body finally insisted on telling, the house lasted 3 more years. It burned cold. Where it had stood, the earth wore only blood-red flowers that opened on August 15th and December nights, and then forgot to exist. Somewhere a boy named Gabriel, Charlotte's later child, ordinary to the eye but not to the touch, grew up talking with people no one else could see and finding what no one else knew had been hidden. He moved quietly as if guided by the tide under the tide. People who met him later would swear he always arrived 1 breath before danger and left 1 breath after mercy. The records are ash and absences. The truth is in the ground, which does not forget. Surveyors in 1923 dug a box from the old foundation and found Charlotte's hand waiting inside it. The confession written the day before the first night. Not confession as in sin, but confession as in witness. She named the women in drawing rooms and back kitchens who had learned from the enslaved and the free, who had stitched together words with needles and herbs and grief, who understood that if a nation builds its house over an unblessed grave, the floor will one day open. "We do not do this out of hatred," she wrote, "but because the future cannot be laid on rot. We open the ledger. We speak the names. The land remembers. Let the living remember too. The plantation today is a field the state owns and does not touch. At dusk, locals circle wide without saying why. On certain heavy nights, lights move through the grass in patterns like a congregation forming, and if you stand where the keeping house stood and close your eyes, you may hear it. The braided sound of work songs and psalms and prayers older than both, the land's own voice humming under it all. What happened that summer and winter at Bogard was not a ghost story, not only. It was a reckoning carried in a woman's fragile, stubborn body, a balancing written in soot and water and blood, the kind of truth that rises when forgetting grows too heavy to hold. Whether Charlotte was chosen or chose, whether she was victim or midwife, the price was paid. The circle tightened. The debt took on a face long enough for men to grow old in a single night. The river keeps its counsel. The wind tells only what it wants. But the ground remembers. And sometimes it remembers out loud.